The poem Exposure was written by the English poet and soldier Wilfred Owen, who is now regarded as the finest of his generation of war poets. It was written in 1918, shortly before the end of the war. However, it wasn't published until 1920, after Owen's death. Like many of Owen's poems, Exposure reveals the brutal and depressing realities of war with a searing honesty. Exposure specifically explores the drudgery and monotony of life in the trenches, with a particular focus on the freezing conditions the soldiers were facing during the winter. The sense of monotony is highlighted through the repeating refrain of "nothing happens," which echoes throughout many of the stanzas. Owen's criticism of the wider purposes of the war are made clear through the voice of the narrator, who asks himself, "What are we doing here?" This video will analyse the meanings and literary methods of the poem Exposure, primarily for the AQA GCSE English Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. If you want to watch my illustrated reading of the poem, or view my other content, click the link at the end and subscribe to my channel, Comics and Lit. Before we read the poem, I'll quickly summarise some key context surrounding Wilfred Owen to help us understand his motivations for writing the poem, which, in turn, will allow us to explore meanings in greater depth. Owen was born in 1893 in Shropshire, England, and like many of his generation, his life was cut short by his participation in the First World War. He died tragically on November 4th, 1918, just a week before Armistice Day, the end of the war. He was awarded the Military Cross for bravery in battle. Owen is famed for his honest and brutal portrayal of the horrors of trench warfare. He, alongside many other war poets, felt burdened by a desire to reveal the truth behind much of the patriotism and propaganda. The poem Exposure was written in 1918, shortly before he died, and depicts the brutal and horrific weather conditions that the soldiers had suffered during the winter of 1917. This was said to be the coldest winter in living memory and caused untold suffering from injuries such as frostbite and hypothermia. Owen described the experience in one of his letters, recalling, "We were marooned in a frozen desert. There was not a sign of life on the horizon, and 1,000 signs of death. The marvel is we did not all die of cold." So Owen, like many of his contemporaries, used poetry as both a means of documenting the suffering soldiers experienced during wartime, but also as a means of informing the public back in Britain, who were sheltered from much information by government censorship, of the appalling conditions the soldiers were experiencing. I will now show the illustrated reading of the poem. As you watch and listen, pay attention for the slow and mournful pace of the poem, which carries a sense of desperation and hopelessness. The poem is structured in 8 stanzas, each containing 5 lines each. It therefore has an ordered and controlled structure, which adds to this sense of boredom and desperation, which is further highlighted by the repeating refrain of "but nothing happens." Our brains ache in the merciless ice-east winds that knife us. Wearied we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more, in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew, we watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. But nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we're dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, now ever suns smile true on child, or field, or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath, we lie out here, therefore were born. For love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Now you've listened to the poem being read, you should have picked up on the sustained mood of hopelessness which Owen maintains through his use of language and structure. Owen wants you to feel what the soldiers feel, hear their intimate thoughts and fears, and of course sympathise with the pain and suffering they experience. Let's start by considering the main themes which Owen explores within the poem. Firstly, the poem presents a no-holds-barred presentation of the reality of warfare. Nothing is celebrated. There seems to be no heroism, only brutality. This was a recurrent theme in many of Owen's poems. Consider how this theme is explored in these lines from another Owen work, Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. As you can see, Owen had little time for notions of heroism in war. To him, war was punishing and brutal, something clearly portrayed in this dark language. Another key theme in the poem is monotony, which means a sense of nothing changing. Perhaps surprisingly for a poem about war, the poem contains very little action, with Owen choosing to zoom in much more on the dull, repetitive existence of life in the trenches. Finally, Owen explores the theme of suffering, in particular at the hands of the elements. The cold and the wind are personified within the poem to explore how even nature itself fought against the helpless soldiers. I will now focus on some structural analysis of the poem. Remember that in poetry, like novels, structure is the organisational techniques a writer uses to create an engaging and satisfying narrative. Exposure has 8 stanzas, each with 5 lines, which, as I stated before, creates a rigid and controlled structure. Each stanza ends with the shorter line, which jars slightly with the longer ones preceding it. Let's look at the first stanza's last 2 lines. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. This use of a shorter line gives more emphasis and power to the final line. The words, but nothing happens, function as a refrain in the poem, being repeated in 4 of the 8 stanzas, creating a sense of dull and monotonous repetition to the reader's experience, mimicking the despair and boredom of the soldiers. To me, with each repetition of the line, it heightens the desperation and despair. There is a sense that the narrator is losing hope more and more as the poem moves towards the end. Structural repetition is also present in the rhyme scheme of the poem. Each stanza uses an A-B-B-A rhyme scheme, which again indicates a sense of nothing changing within the poem. If you look carefully, many of these are actually para-rhymes, or half-rhymes. Take a look at the line endings in the second stanza. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. Can you hear how the rhymes are close in sound, but not a complete match? Wire and war, brambles and rumbles. Owen, a talented poet, could certainly have used complete rhymes if he wanted. So we may ask, is there a hidden message in this structural use of para-rhyme? It can be interpreted as creating a sense of discord or conflict within each stanza, which mirrors the threat the soldiers constantly experienced. Although everything seemed predictable, at any moment death could arrive. Alternatively, the half-rhyme could be said to mimic the unease and frustration the soldiers felt on a daily basis with the conditions they were facing. Now let's consider how Owen uses language throughout the poem to evoke a sense of pity and despair. A method that really stands out within the poem is personification. This is a type of metaphor where a writer gives a human action to an object or thing in order to heighten the impact of a description. Let's look at how Owen uses personification to heighten the sense of threat from the weather. Firstly, we have the merciless iced east winds that knive us. Here the verb knive, which creates a clear imagery of a violent attack, personifies the wind as an enemy assailant. Next, we have the mad gusts tugging on the wire, which personifies the wind as furious or even insane, creating a haunting sense that the soldiers are being tortured by the elements. Another example is the poignant misery of dawn, which is actually a use of the pathetic fallacy, a type of personification associated particularly with emotions. Here it is used to equate the arrival of the sun at dawn with a sense of misery, creating another sense of disharmony, since the arrival of the morning is usually associated with hope. Owen also uses alliteration and assonance regularly throughout the poem. Look at the repetition of the fricative F sound in this line from the 5th stanza. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. The alliteration here is clearly meant to mirror the sound of soldiers shivering from cold. We also see the use of sibilance, which is repetition of the S sound in the line, sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Here it seems to recreate the sound of the hissing bullets as they shoot over the soldiers, creating a heightened sense of threat and fear. Now look at the assonance used in this line from the 6th stanza. Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glozed. The O vowel sound seems to hang across the line, creating a repetitive feeling to the soldier's journey and echoing the theme of monotony. Now we will look at the final stanza. Here Owen employs harsh imagery of frozen flesh with sections such as shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads, and all their eyes are ice. The tone is both desperate and resigned, as the poet seems to lament over the sense that the faces are half known, again expressing the fleeting nature of life in these conditions. The ending of the poem offers no hope, no change, and no relief, as Owen assures us with the final repetition of "nothing happens," that the soldiers have no salvation. If you're looking to compare this poem with others in the collection, the links to the weather could make a good fit with Seamus Heaney's Storm on the Island, which also uses personification to highlight the force of the elements. The poem would also compare well with other poems which deal with the pain and suffering of war. Bayonet Charge, Remains, and War Photographer employ a similarly desperate and hopeless tone in order to convey a sense of the negative impact of war. If you enjoyed this analysis, please support me by liking this video and clicking on the link to subscribe to my channel for more poetry revision content.